Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And first off, congratulations, United States, 250-year birthday here on July 4th. Congratulations to our friend, President of the Private Cloud, Christian Riley, on Happy Second Place Day, as we do every year. And today we're going to talk a little bit about sort of an interesting thing. I know we do AI News of the Month every month with Aaron or Brandon or both of them. Usually we don't cover a whole lot of news throughout the rest of the month. We try and cover trends and topics and things that are going to be applicable. There was an interesting, it wasn't even a news story. It was a interview. It was a discussion that went on one of the financial networks, happened to be with one of the AI companies. And normally I would write a lot of this stuff off and you would go, okay, it's just, some CEO who's on one of the shows and they're, kind of, as we say, talking their book, right? Sort of talking about why their business is great and why all the trends in the markets are moving in their direction and all those sort of things. But this one I thought was sort of interesting in the context of it was, it had a couple of things to it. It had sort of the normal sort of fine line between bravado and craziness that is going on with a lot of the AI leaders right now in terms of, them, sort of walking a fine line between, I'm a tech leader of a company and I'm a god and a deity who should be, worshipped and respected. There was, there's always that aspect of it, but was interesting in the context of, how he was talking about the market and in terms of sort of the challenges and the concerns that are starting to emerge in the market as we get into AI and sort of and this feels like sort of a weird word to talk about sort of freedoms with AI, but control that companies are looking for in terms of their AI deployment. So we're going to dig into that interview and more so kind of the themes that came out of that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 Governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. And we're back. And today what I want to dig into is an interview that was on CNBC, which is one of the American sort of financial news networks. They spend all day long sort of analyzing markets and talking to different people who have impact on the market and analysts of the market and so forth. So the show began as a sort of a financial segment. It was Alex Karp, who is the CEO of Palantir. And the reason he was on the show was that Palantir and NVIDIA have recently made an announcement that normally wouldn't have gotten huge news. It was basically Palantir software plus NVIDIA hardware positioned as a sovereign AI cloud. And that in and of itself, we see that quite a bit between software companies and hardware companies, right? They're going to come together, they're going to work together, they're going to create some sort of unified solution for a certain market segment or a certain use case. So that in of itself wouldn't have gotten a lot of news. Granted, Palantir and NVIDIA, both big players in the AI market, so it would have gotten some news, right? I'm not saying that it doesn't deserve any news whatsoever. But what was interesting, so the panel, who is mostly financial people, not necessarily technical people, but they understand the role of technology. They obviously cover technology companies because they have such a huge influence on the market these days. They have sort of an oversized weighting in the market in terms of indexes and other things like that. And what they sort of got into was, hey, what does this announcement mean? And, why are you doing it? And so forth. And of course, Alex Karp, as he is known to do, you can go take a look at other interviews. I won't sort of try and characterize him, but he is somebody who enjoys the spotlight, somebody who likes to pontificate on where they are in the market, how they are, way ahead of the market, all those sort of things, right? The things that we're getting from sort of AI leaders at this point in time. And it's an interesting interview. I put a link to it in the show notes. It's about 19 minutes long. The first 11 or 12 minutes are mostly focused on technology. The last 6 or 7 minutes get into all sorts of sort of geopolitics and regular politics and tax policy and other things that you probably don't care too much about. And they're very, very, very opinionated. But the first 11 minutes are sort of interesting. And they're interesting in the context of kind of the story that, again, is kind of coming out of this Palantir and NVIDIA partnership, which again isn't unique by any means, right? It's two companies. It's a software stack and a hardware stack kind of being paired together. But what he sort of came out and said was, I thought, very interesting, and it's interesting in the context of not something that we haven't talked about on this show before. So one of the things, the framing of the conversation, and it was sort of a one-sided conversation because Alex did almost all of the talking, right? There was a few kind of questions smattered in there, but for the most part, he did all the talking. And what he really kind of came out and said in the simplest terms was, he said, if you talk to CEOs, and again, not just in the United States, but sort of, he claims sort of globally, he said there's a level of unhappiness and distrust from these CEOs, so corporate CEOs, business CEOs, with the frontier labs. And the concern is really on two fronts. The first is, we think we're paying way too much money for AI, spending a lot of money on tokens for AI without getting any measurable return from them, or at least a big enough measurable return for the investment that we're making. And the second thing he says is, there's a general level of frustration with this concern about, because we're working with you and you are consuming our data within your LLMs through the prompts that we send out and other things like that, you are learning about my business, and ultimately, he keeps using this phrase that they are stealing their alpha. And what that means, for those of you that don't sort of live in the financial market and so forth, alpha in this context is the ability for a company to outperform the market. So essentially what he's saying is, like, you're stealing all of our company secrets, all of our special sauce, all of the things that we do to create a moat within our business, and you are turning those into capabilities that you have within your company. And I highlight this not because any of those things are sort of unique, right? We've talked about this a ton on the show, that right now the cost of AI is both very expensive because there are so few companies, especially at the hardware layer, that are in the marketplace, and so the overall cost to do model building and training and inference and so forth is still very, very high, because again, the amount of competitiveness within the hardware market, while AMD is in the market and Intel's in the market and Cerebras is in the market, they don't really have products yet at this point that are terribly, terribly competitive with NVIDIA. And we've got shortages of chips, right? So the cost of compute in and of itself is extremely high. And then we have the weird thing going on where, and again, we've got shortages of that. So anytime there's shortages or there's, lack of supply, cost goes up. And then we've got the thing where there's so much money in the market that, to a certain extent, the cost of tokens is sort of being subsidized by the largest players. So the frontier labs are essentially subsidizing this, and we see, at points in time where, they talk about, hey, we expect price rises and so forth, and so on and so forth. So, that piece of it we've talked about a lot on the show, the idea that the cost of AI and the return on AI spend to this point has been, sort of out of mismatched and out of whack, if you will, right? So he sort of makes that statement. The other piece that he really kind of gets into, which I thought was interesting, that he highlighted it, and he kept highlighting it on this show in particular, I think because there's a recognition that, while there's a lot of financial market coverage of technology companies, there's not really always an understanding of how the technology works. And so what he kept coming back to this idea that they're frustrated that the frontier labs are quote unquote stealing their alpha, right? So it's sort of because their data is involved with how it interacts, with the company's data is involved with how it interacts with these LLMs, that data is essentially being looked at by the LLMs, being consumed into how they sort of self-train themselves. That's the wrong word, but that's the idea of it. And that, these businesses are essentially giving away their secrets to the LLMs, right? And, this is one of those things that I think it's important to highlight, because I think there is a misconception in the marketplace, right? So I get a chance to talk to a lot of different companies one of the dynamics that went on in our market and still goes on in our market is, there was sort of this initial concern where, companies said, well, I don't know that I want to share my data with these public LLMs, with these sort of public frontier labs. And what ended up happening was the hyperscalers, so whether it was Amazon or Azure or whoever, sort of, and I don't want to say they misled customers, but in essence, they said, well, we'll be able to give you a private instance of that within your VPC or within your sort of secured boundary in the public cloud. And I think the misperception there is that companies believed that, well, okay, if this is within my VPC and I keep my data within my VPC, that's not going anywhere else. And if you read the fine print, and I put a few links in the show notes, the reality is there's still got to be a way for your environment, your VPC sort of private environment, to still get back to these LLMs. It's not as if they carve off and replicate, a Acme XYZ version of Mythos or something like that into your one that never touches anything else. I mean, you're still going back to the main model, right? And so I think it was interesting that he was pointing this out, again, something that I think a lot of us have known, but it seems to be a misperception in the marketplace, in that, I still think there are a lot of companies, even, large companies with security organizations, that are working with these. And the reason for that is, I think they've sort of made a mental decision. I don't know what the sort of math behind it is, but they've sort of made a mental decision of like, well, these frontier models are pretty darn good. Our people really like using them. And quite honestly, it's hard to necessarily get other models at scale because it's hard to get GPUs, right? And this isn't a new thing. We've talked about this on the podcast quite a bit in terms of, if you went to organizations, and this is where the AI era and the cloud era are different, right? The cloud era was, built on this idea that like somebody else would run the compute and infrastructure for you, but there was never a question of like, if you really wanted to do things yourself, there was never a problem of being like, I could get hundreds of compute instances. I could get hundreds of CPU-based instances. We don't have any limitations of that. Essentially, the cost of compute, got down to, very negligible numbers in terms of, the overall spend, but there was never any supply problems for getting CPUs for the most part, right? Occasional blips and so forth. But that's different in the GPU era, right? In the GPU era, most of the GPUs are still very much controlled by, a finite number of companies. It's the hyperscalers, it's the neo clouds, it's, kind of the allocation that NVIDIA has made to its biggest and best customers. And it is very difficult for, even large corporations to get access to GPUs that they own and run themselves, both in terms of access to supply, but also, the latest kind of frontier GPUs, if you will, have a very different characteristic in terms of what they need in the data center, in terms of power and cooling and all these sort of things. And so, the trade-off that's sort of been made is companies have said, well, if I had my druthers and I'm really concerned about not sharing my data, I would find a way to get GPUs and I would host them myself and I would run them myself. But that's so difficult, and the demand within my business to get access to these LLMs and to create results of it is that we're going to sort of, buy into this idea that if we leverage the public cloud services, the hyperscaled services within a VPC, then we're kind of not really giving away our data. And again, this is sort of this misconception, but it's sort of the trade-off that's been made by corporations to do that. And what was interesting about this interview was, he kind of kept coming back to this. And I don't know that it was completely obvious to anybody who's not very technical in watching this, but he kept trying to sort of reinforce it in a way that you do when you're talking to people who kind of understand technology, but don't really understand technology. He just kind of kept coming back to this idea that, they're stealing their alpha. And again, this is, again, where language becomes very difficult. You're on a short show, you're trying to explain stuff. But in essence, what he was saying is, you're giving away to a certain extent your company's secrets, right? And what was really interesting, I think, so that was the first part of the conversation, was he sort of said, look, the reality is, businesses are spending too much on AI. They're spending a lot on AI. They're not necessarily getting ROI on it, and they have these deep concerns that their data is, sort of being used by these frontier models. And I think, it's not hard to kind of identify that claim is pretty accurate when you start looking at the roadmaps of what an OpenAI or an Anthropic or whatever has been coming out with in terms of going like, hey, here's our service to replace legal capabilities. Here's our service to replace marketing capabilities. Here's our service to replace financial planning services and capabilities. It's, part of that is, hey, we've consumed a whole bunch of data about the world. We've figured out how to do these things. But the other part of it is, we're in sort of these markets and we're reinforcing ourselves through these things. So I'm not saying anything net new there, right? So that was the first part of the interview. And again, it was just sort of interesting to see somebody calling that out. Now, again, you always have to remember anytime one of the CEOs goes on these shows, they've got an agenda. Like I said, they're talking their book. You have to sort of go, okay, well, what do you do differently? Obviously, you're trying to paint a picture where, you do something differently. So, if you change the perception of the rules of the game, or you change the rules of the game, you're trying to influence the game to be easier for you to win. Okay, fine. Let's set that aside. The other thing I thought was very interesting was he pointed out, or he was sort of making the argument that, in all of this, statement about, hey, people are spending a lot of money on AI and AI tokens and not necessarily getting the ROI. He sort of made an interesting kind of comparison or phrasing. And I think this is sort of worth reflecting on as well. In essence, he said, right now you've got all these companies that are spending a lot of money on tokens, right? They're essentially spending money on consumption, the using of the models. He said, but it's interesting that the companies that are providing, the frontier labs that are providing it, aren't charging based on outcomes, right? So, his statement there, if you sort of decode it, is, hey, you guys, the frontier labs, make all these statements about how these models are going to be able to do amazing things. They're going to be able to find cures for diseases. You're going to be able to, do all sorts of research that really couldn't be done before, or you're going to be able to do all these things, right? So framed in the context of outputs. But when what he's saying is when you talk to the CEOs who run the companies who, need those outputs in order to run their business because they build cars, or they are doing research for pharmaceuticals, or they are, in the business of, putting airplanes in the sky and landing them safely and all those sorts of things that non-techie, non-software businesses do. He said it's very interesting that the frontier labs are still charging based on tokens and not charging based on outputs. And in essence, the translation for that is, he's saying is, well, if you're saying your tools are capable of doing that, why don't you just do that, right? Why are you making your customers go through all this work to figure out how to make your tool do that if your tool already knows how to do that, right? And I think what's really interesting there is, he sort of says, why are you charging by tokens and not by outcomes? And it's an interesting thing for two reasons. Number one, he makes a very good point that if your tool is capable of doing things, right, are you selling something that is literally just a tool, meaning like, hey, here's a bunch of tools that you could buy at any hardware shop, a saw or a drill or a hammer or whatever. You could make anything you want. You could build a table, you could build a house, you could build a whatever. But just buying those things doesn't make a house pop up, doesn't just make a beautiful table pop up or something, right? They're intended to be tools. But the framing, what he says is the framing of these services and these models is you're going to get outputs. And so he sets up this interesting dynamic, or this interesting question that he sort of is asking, but he didn't explicitly get to this, which is you're charging tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, $1 billion for this service. Why aren't you just taking a fixed amount of money in exchange for a fixed outcome, right? Why are you just charging for tokens? You're essentially just letting people, you're paying for them to learn, right? Which, again, in the context of how AI has been framed is an interesting thing. But the flip side of it is, from a business model perspective, what we're also seeing is that and so he kind of frames that as if like, oh, well, you're just charging people tokens, and as if, well, that's a great business model for the frontier labs, right? Like, oh, if the frontier models wanted to make the most money, what they do is just charge tokens. But what's interesting is the flip side of that is when you look at the economics of all of the frontier labs, even knowing what we know about them, essentially sort of subsidizing these things, is they're all struggling to make money. In fact, they're losing money at, astronomical rates at this point, right? They're constantly having to look for new sources of funding and so forth. And so it does create this interesting sort of dynamic of, why don't you charge for outcomes, which should have sort of, known things, right? Like you could go to a business and say, hey, what would the next breakthrough automobile look like for your marketplace? Okay, here's how we help you get there 3 to 5 years faster, or something along those lines. That should be worth some percentage of what you do, right? So obviously, that relationship of outcomes to what it should be valued at is still unknown to the market, or at least not established in the market. And then the flip side is, if this sort of token maxing, model of engaging with stuff, right? Sort of the same idea of like, well, you could give away the iPhone, like you could give away the computing device or the iPhone or the internet service for free, but as long as you stay on it for a long time, I'm going to charge you. I could make a lot of money from ads, which is sort of the implication he kind of makes here. If that was the case, then these companies would be highly, highly profitable, and they would be highly profitable at a much higher price point than they are today, which is this low price point that's highly being subsidized and so forth. So he kind of, without going into all the details, and this is the challenge of these folks, they live this stuff every day and they talk about it every day. And so they assume everybody else around them is thinking about these things. He kind of points out this same sort of thing, which is both the thing that would seem like their most efficient business model and the current model that they have, neither one of them are sort of executing at a high profitability level. Right. So he kind of calls into question, that piece as it is. And I think he sort of implies that like, hey, the real cost of what the frontier model should be charging is like 3x what they're doing, which I think is pretty reasonable. I think most of the estimates that I've heard from fairly smart people is, if you're not building around the idea of like, it's probably going, the cost of tokens in the future is probably going to be like 5x, maybe more than that. You're going to be building a financial model that probably is going to run into some problems here in the next couple of years when we get to more true costs of what's going on. So, and then the last thing he kind of highlights is, the idea of sort of true cost. And what was interesting was, as he talked about true cost, he didn't really talk about it in the context of like subsidized tokens or subsidized LLM cost. He really was talking about true cost in terms of the cost of protecting your business and understanding that, as you put it in the context of like large enterprise businesses or even governments and so forth, you all, speaking collectively to that group of people, have spent decades, in some cases, centuries, building up your differentiation, building up the thing that differentiates your company or your organization or your business or your country. You've done that in a way that has become profitable enough that you've been able to sustain yourself and survive for a long time. He said you're really not taking into consideration the true cost. In essence, what he's sort of saying is you've spent decades and decades building up this information, this knowledge, this differentiation, this ability to compete in the marketplace, and you're kind of giving that away, and you're not factoring that cost in. So in essence, what he's sort of saying is like, if you could look at the market for startups that do things in what you do, what does the value of that look like, right? Meaning, if you are in the, I don't know, I'll just use the automotive business again. I tend to do that all the time. If you looked at it, if you were Ford Motor Company or you were Honda or somebody like that, some established big company, and you looked out like how much money is being spent or what is the value of all the competitors to what you're doing, you could put a value on that, and you could look at that in terms of, what do I have to do competitively to make sure I compete with that? Are they coming to market with ideas faster? Are they innovating on new capabilities faster and so forth? He said companies are essentially sort of ignoring that as they give these frontier labs access to their data, directly or indirectly. And he said you're kind of vastly underestimating the speed at which they're going to be able to take that information, synthesize it, retrain it back into the models, and then start to compete with you, especially in any area in which you compete digitally. Right now, physically a little bit different. Those timeframes are a little bit longer. But so I thought there was ultimately three kind of key points. Right, the first key point is sort of the cost and ownership is not aligned in terms of what's delivered and what what enterprises are getting today. There was the question of the overall business model of what the frontier models were doing today and companies understanding that. And then the last piece was really trying to kind of get into, do you really understand the competitive nature of this? And again, this kind of goes back to what we always used to talk to when Amazon, we used to kind of make a running joke about this, was every time Amazon would have a keynote, again, Amazon and Amazon Web Services in the context of, kind of being the first public cloud, It was always interesting on day one, at least for a while, to be like, okay, they just announced a bunch of services. Which of those services essentially replace or now directly compete with one of the customers who previously had been their partner, right? And again, the reason they were able to do that was because, their level of insight into what their cloud was delivering, the analytics they saw, the traffic patterns, the customer patterns, and so on and so forth, they were able to look at that and sort of synthetically go, oh, that's a service that is being highly demanded by customers, and those customers also happen to be in our cloud. We should just offer that natively. And again, this is the same sort of thing that we're seeing from the LLMs in terms of, hey, they're no longer just generic question answering machines. They are, kind of big machines that are able to, be a marketing expert, be a finance expert, be a science expert, whatever that thing might be. And we're seeing these services start to roll out. And so that was what he was sort of claiming was, you guys don't seem to understand how fast these internet companies, and or in this case, these frontier labs, are going to move. And this has really been, kind of the repeated theme that we've seen as the theme to the internet, is that incumbent companies never seem to understand how fast the internet companies that are sort of digitally displacing them or digitally disrupting them are going to move until it's a little bit too late. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to, displace those companies. We've seen lots of churn over the last 15, 20 years, but he was, again, trying to reinforce that same thing. So anyways, it's an interesting interview to watch. Like I said, it's about 11 minutes. The first 11 minutes are mostly not too crazy. The last 7 or 8 minutes start to get a little bit way out there, and you start to go, okay, this is kind of the prototype for, crazy Silicon Valley, AI leaders at this point in time, billionaires, blah, blah, blah. But the first 11 minutes are worth looking at. I would look at them through that lens of those three things. But I think they do highlight some things as I've looked at, kind of the reaction in the marketplace once you get past the, hey, crazy person ranting and raving. There does seem to be sort of a lot of, kind of agreement that the points that he makes are things that probably need to start getting reinforced more in the marketplace, just because they are a level of sort of pragmatism. They're not Palantir specific, right? You can kind of strip out the Palantir specific stuff that he talks about. And those 3 points still really kind of come through. So anyways, interesting conversation, interesting in the context of trying to talk about AI as a value or a threat to business in the context of how much control do you have, how much sovereignty do you have over your own data, and so on and so forth. So worth taking a look at. We'll probably come back to it at some point in the AI News of the Week, but I thought it was AI News of the Month. I thought it was interesting just in terms of, hey, yes, there's an interesting talk, but the sort of the things that were kind of not said on purpose, were said, but it also highlights kind of the importance or the challenge of having a conversation between highly technical people and people that aren't highly technical but are around business decision makers, and just seeing the level of difference of conversation that happens, or the level of language, or the types of conversation that happens, the types of language. They sort of align, but they don't really align. And the important thing is to figure out like what was sort of said in between the discussions, because they're both kind of getting towards the same thing, but they don't kind of meet in the middle. So anyways, with that, hope you enjoyed the show today. Hope it's worth your time in terms of digging into it. Happy 250th birthday to the folks in the United States. And with that, we will wrap it up, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things enterprise AI.